I'm from Brazil and Portuguese is my first language. But since I moved to Canada 16 years ago, the language I predominantly speak daily is English. Yet, I still have a very noticeable foreign accent. All it takes is for me to say one word in English, like hello, and any native English speaker can very quickly pick up on my accent. Accents are difficult to overcome despite the passage of time. Some linguistic studies say that once you go past the developmental stage as a child of learning your first language, your distinctive manner of speaking, your tone, and intonation are hardwired and serve as the basis for your pronunciation of a second language. Eric Bakovich, a linguist from the University of California, explained that when you hear a new language, say language X, you start mapping the sounds of language X onto the language you already know. And instead of pronouncing the sounds of language X, you piece together a rough approximation based on the sounds your brain already knows. So essentially, what comes out of my mouth when I speak English is my brain's own take on the English language. This explanation might seem obvious to some, but in my experience, there's a lot of misunderstanding about foreign accents. This misunderstanding can sometimes lead to impatience or frustration by some native English speakers. Once, a friend of mine corrected my pronunciation. Sounding a little frustrated, she said, "You don't live your house, you leave your house." Another friend, seemingly annoyed, asked me, "Why do you call our friend Nicholas Nick? It's Nick." See, in both of these instances, I couldn't hear my mispronunciation. And only recently, I learned that there's a scientific reason why. Eric Bakovich said that as a baby, you start learning a new language by picking up sounds and imitating your parents, and then your brain gets busy doing something else and assumes that you have learned all the sounds you need to learn to communicate with people. The result being your brain ends up with an incomplete library of sounds. And guess what? We become effectively deaf to sounds that fall outside of that library. Dr. Patricia Cole, director of the University of Washington's Institute for Learning and Brain Science, came to the same conclusion. Her studies showed that at birth, infants are what she called citizens of the world, because they can hear differences between all the consonants and vowels used in any language. As adults, we are no longer citizens of the world. We are what she called culture-bound listeners, because we can hear differences in the sounds used in our own language, but have difficulty with the sounds of other languages. Once we become aware of our mispronunciation, we can practice and try to improve it. But learning as an adult to hold your mouth and tongue in a certain position at the required speed to carry on a conversation is hard. I took speech lessons a few years ago, and it was incredibly helpful, but it didn't fix my accent. I make a conscious effort every time I speak English to replicate by memory sounds that do not exist in my first language. The reality is that having an accent is not a choice, and most researchers agree that acquiring a native-like accent of a second language as an adult is almost impossible. Still, in my opinion, which is entirely based on anecdotal evidence, there is a perception that if you have an accent, it's because you're not working hard enough to get rid of it. Paul Graham, a startup guru, said in an interview to Inc. magazine in 2013 that startups whose CEO have a strong foreign accent are less likely to succeed. He then said, and I quote, "I'm not sure why. It could be that there are a bunch of subtle things entrepreneurs have to communicate and can't if you have a strong accent. Or it could be that anyone with half a brain would realize you're going to be more successful if you speak idiomatic English. So they must just be clueless if they haven't gotten rid of their strong accent." Paul Graham received a lot of criticism for his statement, and later he clarified that he was talking about founders whose accent is so strong that people can't understand them. My comment on Paul Graham's statement is that yes, you can improve a strong foreign accent, but that doesn't happen overnight. It takes a lot of patience, time, and dedication. Timing is also an important factor. Personally, I had been living in Canada for 6 years before I started focusing on my accent. Before then, I was busy adapting to a new culture, improving my English, and also studying to obtain my law degree. And that's why I will repeat that having an accent is not a choice. Having an accent is also not an indicator of someone's intelligence, knowledge, credibility, competence, IQ, EQ, and the list goes on. Studies show, however, that people who speak with a foreign accent are often considered less intelligent and less believable than native English speakers, and as a result, they can be treated unfairly. We refer to that as accent bias or accent discrimination. Cognitive effort is pointed as one reason behind accent bias. Psycholinguist Shuri Lev-Ari conducted a very interesting experiment. She recorded native and non-native English speakers repeating trivia statements like, "Ants don't sleep." The recordings were then played back to native English speakers, who rated the statements as less true when spoken by a non-native English speaker. Based on her experiment, though, she concluded that people believe non-native speakers less because they are harder to understand. So I don't suggest we ignore the fact that it is harder for our brains to understand a foreign accent. But aside from cognitive effort or other scientific reasons explaining accent bias, we must be mindful that external factors such as misunderstanding or stereotypes attached to certain accents are major contributors to accent bias. I believe we all have a role to play in making sure that we don't condone or take part in accent bias. And you may be asking yourself, why should I care? To cite only a couple of reasons. First, because immigration is here to stay. Canada, for instance, has one of the highest immigration rates of any country. And based on projections by Statistics Canada, immigrants might represent between 24 and 30% of the country's population in 2036. Second, because immigrants contribute significantly to a country's economy. The Financial Post indicated that in Canada, more than 9 million baby boomers are set to retire over the next decade, creating a potential labor shortage that, if unchecked, could raise healthcare costs or halt the country's economic growth. Immigration is pointed as the main solution. If you want to be part of the solution to end accent bias, I have a few suggestions. Start by checking yourself for accent bias. For instance, observe if you give more credibility to the opinion of a colleague who does not have an accent versus one who does have an accent. Ask yourself why, and try to answer that question as honestly as possible. Be empathetic. Recognize that improving an accent is part of a journey, and people go through that journey at their own individual pace. Understand that some people are more skilled than others at mastering a foreign accent. Be mindful that a person's accent is very much part of their identity. So if you mock their accent, they are likely to take that very personally. And last but not least, if someone at work who reports to you has a foreign accent, try to walk in their shoes. For instance, learn a word or two in their language, a greeting, for instance, and say to them with your best accent. During my talk, I mentioned that a person's accent is not an indicator of that person's intellectual capability. Now, I'd like to leave you with what I believe can be equated with having a foreign accent. Having a foreign accent can be a sign of grit, perseverance, resilience, and above all, bravery. Thank you.